April 18th, 1943, the sky above Bougainville. The morning breaks hot and humid over the Solomon Islands. The kind of oppressive tropical heat that turns flight suits into second skins and makes every breath feel like inhaling steam. It's exactly 7:35 in the morning, and high above the dense jungle canopy of Bougainville, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will change the course of the Pacific War in ways that won't be fully understood for decades. 18. American P-38 Lightning fighters are screaming through the air at wave-top altitude, their twin engines roaring in perfect synchronization as they skim so low over the turquoise waters that their propeller wash kicks up spray behind them. They've been flying for over 2 hours, navigating by dead reckoning across 400 miles of open ocean, maintaining radio silence so complete that the only sounds are the mechanical thunder of their Allison engines and the wind shrieking past their canopies. These men are not flying a routine patrol. They are not hunting ordinary targets. They are assassins, and their target is the architect of Pearl Harbor himself, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who woke the sleeping giant, the strategic genius who commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy, and arguably the most valuable military mind in the entire empire of the rising sun. This is Operation Vengeance, and what happens in the next 18 minutes will demonstrate something profound about American resolve, about the terrifying efficiency of breaking enemy codes, and about the price of symbolism in warfare. This is the story of how America committed its most calculated, most controversial, and perhaps most necessary assassination of World War II, and the forgotten pilots who pulled it trigger. To understand why 18 American fighters are hunting one man across the Pacific on this sweltering April morning, you have to go back exactly 16 months, 3 weeks, and 1 day to December 7th, 1941, when Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated the most devastating surprise attack in American history. Yamamoto didn't want to attack Pearl Harbor. That's the irony that history often forgets. This Harvard-educated admiral, this man who had lived in America, who had studied American industry and American character, who had walked the streets of Washington, D.C., and traveled across the continental United States. He knew what many of his colleagues in Tokyo did not, that attacking America was, in his own words, like awakening a sleeping giant and filling him with terrible resolve. He had argued against war with the United States. He had warned the militant factions in Tokyo that Japan might win victories for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that he had utterly no confidence in their prospects after that. But when the decision was made, when the civilian government collapsed and the militarists took control, Yamamoto did what good military men do, even when they disagree with policy. He executed his orders with devastating perfection. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of military planning, a surgical strike that demonstrated everything Yamamoto understood about carrier warfare, about concentration of force, about achieving surprise through meticulous preparation and operational security. On that Sunday morning, Japanese carrier aircraft killed 2,403 Americans, wounded 1,178 more, sank 4 battleships and damaged 4 others, destroyed 188 aircraft, and delivered a psychological blow that reverberated through every corner of American society. The attack was supposed to buy Japan time, to cripple American naval power long enough for Japan to consolidate its conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, to create a defensive perimeter so formidable that America would eventually negotiate rather than pay the blood price of reconquest. It was brilliant strategy, executed with clockwork precision. It was also the single greatest miscalculation in modern Japanese history because Yamamoto's prophecy proved correct. America didn't negotiate, didn't accept the new reality, didn't calculate costs and benefits like a rational actor. America got angry, and in the 16 months since Pearl Harbor, that anger has been transforming itself into industrial might, into millions of men under arms, into Essex-class carriers sliding down shipways at a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. By April 1943, the tide is beginning to turn. Guadalcanal has been secured after 6 months of savage fighting. The Japanese advance has been halted, and now, in Washington, D.C., in the offices where strategic decisions are made, and where intercepts of enemy communications are analyzed by some of the brightest minds in American intelligence, a decision is being contemplated that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. the targeted killing of an enemy commander, not in battle, but through premeditated assassination based on broken codes and perfect intelligence. Yamamoto, for his part, has become more than just a military commander to both sides. To the Japanese, he is a symbol of their naval tradition, a living embodiment of Bushido and strategic brilliance, the victor of Pearl Harbor and the architect of their early victories. To Americans, he is something else entirely. He is the face of December 7th, the man responsible for those burning battleships and those rows of flag-draped coffins, the personification of Japanese aggression and treachery. The propaganda posters don't show Emperor Hirohito as the enemy. They show caricatures based on Yamamoto, the anger, the desire for revenge, the hunger for symbolic justice. It all focuses on this one man. And in April 1943, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii intercept a routine message from Yamamoto's headquarters that contains information so valuable, so operationally significant, that it immediately gets kicked up the chain of command all the way to Navy Secretary Frank Knox, and ultimately to President Franklin Roosevelt himself. The message details Yamamoto's travel itinerary for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. It lists departure times, arrival times, the type of aircraft he'll be flying in, even the number of fighter escorts. It is, in essence, an engraved invitation to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. If the Americans are willing to cross a line that has rarely been crossed in modern warfare, and if they can pull off a fighter interception of such precision and difficulty that it borders on the impossible, the intelligence lands on Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Hawaii like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Nimitz, the soft-spoken Texan who replaced Admiral Kimmel after Pearl Harbor, is not a man given to rash decisions or emotional reactions, but even he recognizes the magnitude of what's being proposed. This isn't about tactics or normal military operations. This is about deliberate assassination, about killing a specific individual in a way that feels less like warfare and more like an execution. The ethical questions swirl immediately. Is this legitimate military action or murder? Will killing Yamamoto actually help the war effort? Or will it simply create a martyr and potentially replace him with someone more aggressive, less predictable? And perhaps most importantly, is it worth potentially revealing to the Japanese that their naval codes have been broken? A secret so valuable that it gives America an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Japanese moves. These questions go all the way to the White House, where Roosevelt himself makes the final decision. The answer is yes. Kill him. The reasoning is partly strategic. Yamamoto's death will disrupt Japanese naval operations at a critical moment. And partly psychological. America needs a victory that resonates, that shows the Japanese that nowhere is safe, that even their most protected commanders can be reached and destroyed. It's a message written in blood and aviation fuel, and Roosevelt believes it's a message worth sending. The operational planning falls to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding air operations in the Guadalcanal area, and to his intelligence officers who immediately recognize the extraordinary difficulty of what's being asked. The intercept reveals that Yamamoto will depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock in the morning on April 18th, flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the type the Americans call Betty, with an escort of 6 Zero fighters. He'll fly over open ocean and then over the southern tip of Bougainville to reach the airstrip at Balal, a small island near Buin. The flight will take approximately 2 hours. For the Americans to intercept him, they'll need to fly from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, which is over 400 miles away, well beyond the combat radius of most American fighters. They'll need to time their departure so precisely that they arrive at the intercept point within a window of perhaps 5 minutes, because Yamamoto's itinerary is military precise and he won't be early or late. They'll need to fly the entire distance at near zero altitude to avoid Japanese radar and coast watchers, which means navigating by compass and dead reckoning across featureless ocean with no landmarks and no room for error. And they'll need to do all of this while maintaining absolute radio silence, then climb to intercept altitude, fight through the Zero escort, and shoot down one specific aircraft among the 2 bombers Yamamoto will be traveling in, all before Japanese reinforcements from nearby airfields can respond. It's not just difficult, it's borderline insane. The only aircraft in the American inventory that can possibly pull this off is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that has the range, the speed, and the firepower for the mission. Major John Mitchell, the commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, gets tapped to lead the mission. Mitchell is a by-the-book officer, methodical and precise. Not particularly flashy, but exactly the kind of steady hand you want planning something this complex. He selects 18 aircraft for the mission. 16 with their normal fuel loads, plus 2 with specially modified external fuel tanks to ensure they can make the round trip. The mission plan is elegantly simple in concept, but nightmarishly difficult in execution. Fly to a precise intercept point 35 miles off the coast of Bougainville. Arrive at exactly 9:35 in the morning. Climb to intercept altitude at the last possible moment and hit Yamamoto's formation as it descends toward Balale. 4 aircraft, the killer section, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and including Lieutenant Rex Barber, will go after the bombers. The other 14 will engage the Zero escorts and any Japanese reinforcements that show up. Mitchell spends hours calculating fuel consumption, wind drift, and navigation points. There are no GPS systems, no satellite guidance, no electronic aids beyond basic radio compasses that they won't be able to use anyway because of the radio silence requirement. This will be pure airmanship, the kind of dead reckoning navigation that requires absolute confidence in your instruments and your calculations, because 1 degree of error over 400 miles means missing the target by miles. The pilots who will fly this mission are told nothing about their target initially, just that it's important, that the mission is voluntary, and that it will be dangerous. When Mitchell finally reveals that they're hunting Yamamoto himself, the reaction is immediate and visceral. These men have all lost friends to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Many of them were at Pearl Harbor or arrived in the Pacific shortly after, when America was reeling and losing, when it felt like the Japanese were unstoppable. The chance to kill the man who started it all, who planned Pearl Harbor, who represents everything they've been fighting against. It's like being offered a chance at perfect revenge. Lieutenant Rex Barber, one of the killer section pilots, will later describe the feeling in the ready room when they learned the target. It was like electricity running through them, a mixture of excitement and grim determination, and the understanding that they were about to participate in something historic. Captain Thomas Lanphier, the other killer section leader, is more flamboyant, more eager for glory. He immediately understands that whoever shoots down Yamamoto will earn a place in history, will become the answer to a trivia question that will be asked for generations. Who killed the man who planned Pearl Harbor? The tension between these two men, between Lanphier's desire for recognition and Barber's workmanlike professionalism, will create a controversy that lasts longer than either man's life, a bitter dispute about who actually fired the fatal shots that won't be fully resolved even decades later. April 18, 1943, 0710 hours, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air is already thick with heat and humidity as 18 P-38 Lightnings begin their takeoff rolls, their twin Allison engines combining into a thunderous roar that echoes across the beaten-up airstrip. John Mitchell leads them off first, followed by the others in rapid succession, and within minutes they're formed up and turning northwest, dropping to wave-top altitude as they begin the longest fighter intercept mission attempted so far in the Pacific War. The flight out is an exercise in controlled anxiety. The P-38s cruise at barely 200 feet, low enough that the pilots can see individual whitecaps on the ocean below, high enough to avoid actually kissing the water if they hit turbulence or lose concentration. It's exhausting flying. The constant attention required to maintain altitude, to keep formation, to monitor fuel consumption and engine temperatures while simultaneously navigating by compass heading and elapsed time. There are no landmarks, nothing but endless blue water stretching to every horizon, and the knowledge that if they've miscalculated by even a degree or two, they'll arrive at empty sky and Yamamoto will live. 2 of the 18 fighters abort with mechanical problems. One loses a fuel pump, another develops engine trouble, leaving 16 aircraft to continue the mission. Mitchell checks his watch obsessively, calculating and recalculating their fuel state, their time to target, mentally reviewing the plan, while simultaneously processing the 1,000 small decisions that formation flying at low altitude demands. They've been flying for over 2 hours when Mitchell makes the decision to start their climb. They're approximately 30 miles off the coast of Bougainville, and if his calculations are correct, if his dead reckoning navigation across 400 miles of featureless ocean is accurate, Yamamoto should be approaching from the north in approximately 5 minutes. The P-38s begin climbing, their engines roaring as they claw for altitude. And that's when someone breaks radio silence with two words that make every pilot's heart rate spike. Bogies, 11 o'clock. There, exactly where John Mitchell's navigation predicted they would be, exactly on schedule, as if Yamamoto himself is determined to prove Japanese punctuality even in the face of death, are two Mitsubishi G4M bombers flying in formation at approximately 4,500 feet, surrounded by their escort of 6 Zero fighters. For a moment, the Americans are almost stunned by the perfection of the intercept. They've flown 435 miles by compass and clock, and they've arrived at precisely the right place at precisely the right time to within less than 1 minute of their planned intercept. It's a navigational achievement that will be studied in military academies for decades, the kind of airmanship that seems almost superhuman in an age before GPS and satellite communications. But there's no time to appreciate the accomplishment because now the hard part begins. Mitchell takes the majority of the formation high to engage the Zero escorts, which are already reacting to the American aircraft, turning toward the threat and preparing to defend their precious cargo. The 4 killer section aircraft, Lanphier, Barber, and their 2 wingmen drop their external fuel tanks and dive toward the bombers, which have now broken formation and are diving for the jungle canopy, trying to use low altitude and maneuverability to escape. What happens next will be debated, litigated, and argued about for the rest of the 20th century. But the basic facts are these. Thomas Lanphier engages and shoots down one of the bombers, which crashes into the jungle with enormous force, cartwheeling through the trees and disintegrating in a fireball that scatters wreckage across a quarter-mile of dense tropical forest. Rex Barber pursues the second bomber out over the ocean, raking it with repeated bursts of 50 caliber machine gun fire and 20mm cannon shells, watching pieces fly off the aircraft before it finally ditches into the water offshore and breaks apart on impact. The entire engagement lasts less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of violent, close-range aerial combat where Zeros and Lightnings are turning and firing and dying in the tropical sky above Bougainville. One P-38 is shot down by Zeros, the pilot killed instantly. The remaining Americans fight their way clear and turn for home, their fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels after the high-speed combat and the 400-mile flight in. They've done what they came to do. They've shot down both bombers, killed the escort, and survived. But they don't know yet which bomber carried Yamamoto, don't know if they've actually killed their target or just destroyed 2 random aircraft. It won't be until they land back at Henderson Field, until the intelligence officers start piecing together reports and the Japanese radio traffic explodes with urgent, confused transmissions, that they'll understand what they've accomplished. The bomber that Thomas Lanphier shot down was carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Japanese search parties find the wreckage the next day, and in it, they find Yamamoto's body, still strapped into his seat, thrown clear in the crash, but killed by the impact and the violence of the shoot-down. He has 2 bullet wounds, one in his left shoulder blade and one in the back of his skull that exited through his left eye, though whether these came from the crash or from Lanphier's guns will never be definitively determined. What is certain is that the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy, the strategic genius who Winston Churchill once called the embodiment of the Japanese Navy and its spirit, is dead at the age of 59, killed by American fighters acting on intelligence from broken codes, shot down over the jungles of a distant island in a war that is only halfway complete. The Japanese are devastated. Yamamoto wasn't just another admiral. He was a symbol, a father figure to the fleet, a man whose strategic vision and leadership held the Navy together through the difficult transition from peace to war to the grinding attrition of 1943. His death sends shockwaves through the Japanese command structure, creating a leadership vacuum that will never be adequately filled. His replacement, Admiral Minechi Koga, is competent, but lacks Yamamoto's strategic brilliance and his understanding of American psychology. More importantly, Yamamoto's death is a message that the Japanese high command can't ignore. Nowhere is safe anymore, no one is untouchable, and the Americans are willing to take extraordinary risks to kill high-value targets. The immediate aftermath of Operation Vengeance is complicated by secrecy and propaganda considerations. The Americans desperately want to trumpet their success, to tell the world that they've killed Yamamoto, to use it as a propaganda victory and a morale boost. But doing so risks revealing that American codebreakers have penetrated Japanese naval communications, a secret so valuable that losing it could cost thousands of American lives in future operations. The compromise is to wait. The Americans say nothing for weeks, letting the Japanese announce Yamamoto's death themselves, framing it initially as an accident or combat loss without acknowledging the targeted nature of the attack. When the Americans finally confirm the kill, they claim it was based on routine patrol activity and luck, not specific intelligence. The Japanese never seem to realize that their codes are compromised, or if they suspect it, they don't act on those suspicions. The secret holds, and American intelligence continues to read Japanese naval communications for the rest of the war. For the pilots involved, the mission becomes both the highlight of their careers and the source of lifelong controversy. The question of who actually killed Yamamoto, who fired the fatal shots, turns into a bitter, decades-long dispute, primarily between Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber. Lanphier claims credit immediately, writing detailed after-action reports describing how he shot down the first bomber in a spectacular low-altitude engagement. He becomes a celebrity, does speaking tours, accepts a Navy Cross, and spends the rest of his life telling the story of how he killed Yamamoto. Barber is more circumspect, more uncomfortable with publicity. But as evidence accumulates over the years, including Japanese reports about where Yamamoto's wreckage was found, analysis of the crash site, and testimony from other pilots, it becomes increasingly clear that Barber's claim is stronger, that the bomber he shot down and watched crash into the ocean was actually the decoy, and that Lanphier's kill in the jungle was Yamamoto's plane. The controversy becomes ugly, personal, filled with accusations of glory-seeking and stolen credit. It's never fully resolved before both men die, though most historians now believe that Lanphier fired the fatal shots, even if Barber's role was equally important to the mission's success. The controversy reveals something uncomfortable about heroism and recognition, about how the clean narratives we tell about military operations often obscure messy truths about credit and ego, and the very human desire to be remembered. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death is harder to quantify, but undeniably significant. The Imperial Japanese Navy loses its most experienced and capable commander at exactly the moment when Japanese fortunes are beginning to turn negative. Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Koga, lacks both his predecessor's genius and his credibility with the naval aviators who form the striking arm of the fleet. More importantly, Yamamoto's death has a psychological impact that ripples through both sides. For the Japanese, it's a shock to the sense of invincibility that had carried them through the early war. If even Yamamoto can be killed, then no one is safe. For the Americans, it's a symbol of resurgence, proof that the tide has turned, that the defensive phase is over and the offensive phase is beginning. The man who planned Pearl Harbor is dead, killed by American ingenuity and American air power and American determination to balance the books of December 7th. It doesn't win the war. There are still 2 years of savage fighting ahead, still Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the atomic bombs. But it's a moment when the trajectory of the war becomes clear to anyone paying attention. Japan is going to lose. It's just a question of how long it takes and how much blood gets spilled in the process. There's also the uncomfortable question of assassination and targeted killing in warfare. Questions that remain relevant today in an age of drone strikes and special operations raids against high-value targets. Was killing Yamamoto a legitimate military action or murder? The laws of war in 1943 are less clear on this question than modern international humanitarian law. But the general principle is that military commanders are legitimate targets in wartime. Yamamoto wasn't a civilian, wasn't a politician. He was an active military commander traveling to inspect combat units in a war zone. By any reasonable standard, he was a legitimate target. But the premeditated nature of the attack, the use of broken codes to set up what amounts to an ambush, the specific targeting of one individual rather than general combat operations, it all has a flavor of assassination that makes some observers uncomfortable, even 80 years later. The Americans in 1943 clearly wrestled with these questions before approving the mission, and the fact that the decision went all the way to Roosevelt suggests that they understood they were crossing a line, even if they believed it was a necessary crossing. The precedent set by Operation Vengeance echoes through subsequent decades of American military operations. from attempts to kill Saddam Hussein with precision-guided munitions to drone strikes against terrorist leaders in the War on Terror. The ethical framework established in 1943, that enemy commanders in wartime are legitimate targets regardless of whether they're in combat at the moment of attack, remains the legal and moral justification for targeted killings today. 80 years after Operation Vengeance, the mission remains one of the most perfectly executed fighter intercepts in military aviation history and one of the most consequential targeted killings of World War II. The navigational precision required to fly 435 miles by dead reckoning and arrive at the target within 1 minute of the planned time is almost superhuman, a testament to John Mitchell's skill and the professionalism of the pilots who flew the mission. The intelligence work that made it possible, the codebreakers who penetrated Japanese naval communications, the analysts who recognized the significance of Yamamoto's travel itinerary, the decision-makers who understood what an opportunity they had, represents the Allied intelligence advantage at its finest. And the execution of the mission itself, the 3-minute aerial combat that ended with Yamamoto dead and most of the American pilots returning safely home, demonstrates the increasing skill and confidence of American aviators in 1943 as opposed to the desperate, often outmatched Americans of 1942. But Operation Vengeance also raises questions that have never been fully answered. Did killing Yamamoto actually shorten the war or change its outcome? The evidence is ambiguous. Japan's decline in 1943 and 1944 was driven by American industrial superiority, by the massive buildup of ships and aircraft and trained personnel that would have overwhelmed Japan, regardless of who commanded its navy. Yamamoto's replacement was less capable, but it's not clear that even Yamamoto could have changed the fundamental trajectory of the Pacific War after mid-1943. The Americans had too many carriers, too many aircraft, too many submarines that were strangling Japan's merchant fleet and cutting off the resources that fed its war machine. Yamamoto himself had predicted that Japan couldn't win a long war against America, and by April 1943, his prediction was proving accurate. His death may have accelerated Japan's defeat by months, or it may have made no difference at all to the timeline. What it definitely did was provide a symbolic victory, a moment of revenge and justice that resonated with the American public and gave concrete form to the abstract progress of a war being fought thousands of miles from the continental United States. The controversy over who killed Yamamoto, the bitter dispute between Lamphere and Barber that lasted until both men died, reveals something about the nature of heroism and the hunger for recognition that lies at the heart of military culture. Both men were heroes by any reasonable definition. Both risked their lives on a dangerous mission. Both executed their parts professionally. Both contributed to the mission's success. But the need to identify one single person as the man who killed Yamamoto, the desire for a simple narrative with a clear protagonist, created a competition for credit that turned ugly and personal. It's a reminder that the clean stories we tell about war, the hero narratives and the moment of triumph tales, often obscure more complicated realities about collaboration, about luck, about the way credit gets assigned and history gets written. The truth is probably that Lamphere fired the shots that killed Yamamoto, but that Barber's role was equally essential, and that neither man could have succeeded without John Mitchell's navigation, without the other pilots who engaged the Zeros, without the intelligence officers and codebreakers who made the mission possible. Heroism is usually a team sport, even when we want to write it as a solo performance. The mission also demonstrates the double-edged nature of intelligence success. Breaking Japanese naval codes gave America an enormous advantage throughout the Pacific War, but that advantage was only valuable as long as the Japanese didn't know their communications were compromised. Every time American commanders used intelligence derived from broken codes, whether to ambush convoys, to position forces before a battle, or to assassinate Yamamoto, they risked revealing the source of their information. The decision to kill Yamamoto despite that risk shows how valuable American leadership considered his death, how important the symbolic and psychological impact was judged to be. The fact that the Japanese never realized their codes were broken, or never acted on their suspicions if they did suspect, suggests that the Americans successfully managed the risk. But it was a risk nonetheless, and one that could have cost thousands of American lives if it had gone wrong. In the world of intelligence and covert operations, success is often about balancing competing risks and making calculated gambles based on incomplete information. Operation Vengeance was one of those gambles that paid off, but it could easily have gone the other way. On a muggy spring day in 1943, 18 American fighter pilots climbed into their P-38 Lightnings and flew into history, hunting the man who had struck Pearl Harbor and changed the course of a war. What they accomplished that day was more than just a successful mission. It was a reckoning, a balancing of moral accounts, a demonstration that even in the vast emptiness of the Pacific theater, American reach was long and American memory was longer. Isoroku Yamamoto had warned his government that attacking America was like awakening a sleeping giant. In the jungle wreckage of his bomber on Bougainville, surrounded by the humid overgrowth and the screaming of tropical birds, his prophecy found its ultimate vindication. The giant had awakened, and it had reached across 400 miles of ocean with uncanny precision to strike him down. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men, farm boys and factory workers' sons who had learned to fly and found themselves on the front lines of a global war. What they accomplished required extraordinary skill, yes, but also extraordinary determination, extraordinary courage, and a willingness to risk everything for a mission whose importance they might not fully understand, but whose necessity they absolutely believed in. They flew into uncertain danger on the strength of intelligence they had to trust, but couldn't verify, navigated by compass and clock across empty ocean, fought a 3-minute aerial battle in someone else's sky, and came home having changed history. In an age of smart weapons and satellite guidance, of drones that can strike targets halfway around the world with the press of a button, it's easy to forget how difficult and dangerous these missions were, how much they depended on human skill and human judgment, and the kind of airmanship that can't be taught, only learned through experience and natural talent. The death of Yamamoto didn't end the Pacific War. 2 more years of savage combat lay ahead. The island-hopping campaign through the Marshalls and Marianas, the liberation of the Philippines, the apocalyptic battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the firebombing of Japanese cities, and finally the atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945. Tens of thousands more Americans would die before victory over Japan Day. Hundreds of thousands more Japanese would perish, military and civilian alike, in the grinding attrition of a war that Japan could not win but would not surrender. But on April 18, 1943, something shifted. The man who had planned the attack that brought America into the war was dead, killed by American ingenuity and American resolve, and the message was clear to anyone in Tokyo paying attention. This war would end only one way, and that way involved American bombers over Japanese cities and American boots on Japanese soil. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He had argued against war precisely because he knew how it would end. In his death, he became final proof of his own prophecy. The tragic figure who saw the future clearly but couldn't prevent it, who executed his orders with brilliance, but knew that brilliance wouldn't be enough. Today, if you visit the crash site deep in the Bougainville jungle, there's almost nothing left. The wreckage was salvaged or reclaimed by nature decades ago, swallowed by the same dense tropical growth that tried to hide it in 1943. The men who flew the mission are gone now too. Lanphier died in 1987, Barber in 2001, Mitchell in 1995. Their dispute about credit has faded into historical footnote, overtaken by the larger truth that they all participated in something extraordinary, something that required each of them to be exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right moment. The codebreakers who made it possible, the patient mathematicians and linguists who spent years breaking Japanese naval codes, are mostly forgotten outside of intelligence circles, their names classified for decades after the war. Even Yamamoto himself has become a more complex figure in historical memory, recognized in Japan and America alike as a brilliant strategist who opposed the war but executed it with devastating efficiency, a man trapped between his convictions and his duty. What remains is the mission itself, Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38s flying into the morning sun over the Solomon Islands, navigating by dead reckoning to kill one specific man in a war that would claim tens of millions of lives. It remains as one of the most precise, most calculated, most successful targeted killings in military history, a demonstration of what intelligence, air power, and human skill can accomplish when they align perfectly. It's a story about revenge, yes, but also about capability, about the transformation of American military power from the desperate improvisation of 1942 to the confident professionalism of 1943. It's a story about the price of symbolic victories and the value of removing skilled enemy commanders from the battlefield. It's a story about the ethical lines that get crossed in total war and whether those crossings can be justified by necessity and military value. And ultimately, it's a story about how wars are won, not just by industrial might and numerical superiority, but by the accumulated small victories, the successful missions, the enemy commanders who don't make it home, the intelligence coups that give one side a decisive edge. There's a photograph taken at Henderson Field after the mission, showing some of the pilots celebrating, grinning at the camera. Young men who've just accomplished something they know is important, even if they can't yet understand its full significance. They look tired, drained by the physical and emotional stress of 4 hours of intense flying and 3 minutes of aerial combat. But they also look satisfied, vindicated, like men who've settled a debt that's been hanging over them since December 7th, 1941. In their faces you can see the transformation of the American military from victim to victor, from the stunned defender of Pearl Harbor to the confident attacker of Bougainville. That transformation didn't happen in one mission or one battle. It was the cumulative result of millions of individual efforts, of factories working triple shifts and training programs churning out pilots and codebreakers, decrypting enemy messages, and planners orchestrating increasingly complex operations. But Operation Vengeance crystallized that transformation into a single moment, a single mission, a single enemy aircraft tumbling into the jungle and taking with it one of Japan's most valuable military minds. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Operation Vengeance is how unremarkable it seemed to become. Within weeks, it was classified, buried under layers of secrecy to protect the code-breaking advantage that made it possible. Within months, it was overshadowed by larger operations, the invasion of Italy, the island-hopping campaign gaining momentum, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan beginning to ramp up. Within years, it was just another mission in a war full of missions, another name in the history books, another story that gets told when people talk about World War II aviation. But for the men who planned it, the men who flew it, the enemy commander who died in it, and the strategic balance of the Pacific War that shifted because of it, Operation Vengeance was something more. It was the moment when America's long reach and longer memory caught up with the architect of Pearl Harbor and delivered justice at 4,000 feet above the jungles of Bougainville. It was the day the sleeping giant proved that it could strike with surgical precision, as well as overwhelming force, that it could hunt down individual enemy commanders as effectively as it could build fleets and bomb cities. It was the day Isoroku Yamamoto's prophecy came full circle, when the terrible resolve he had predicted found him in the sky over the Solomon Islands and ended his war forever. And somewhere in all of that, in the navigation calculations and the broken codes, in the machine gun bursts and the jungle wreckage, in the revenge accomplished and the strategic advantage gained, there's a truth about warfare that transcends World War II and remains relevant today. That wars are won by the side that combines intelligence with capability, patience with audacity, careful planning with bold execution. Operation Vengeance was all of those things, performed by ordinary men who did something extraordinary, because that's what their country asked of them, and what the moment demanded. That's the real legacy of April 18th, 1943. Not just that America killed Yamamoto, but that America had become the kind of military power that could plan such a mission, execute it flawlessly, and make it look almost routine. The sleeping giant hadn't just awakened, it had learned to strike with precision, and it would spend the next 2 years proving that lesson again and again until the war was won and the books were finally balanced. The mission was called Vengeance. And Vengeance, on that April morning over Bougainville, flew on twin engines at wave-top altitude, navigated 400 miles by compass and prayer, and found its target exactly where mathematics and broken codes said it would be. The rest, as they say, is history.